All right, everybody, welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. I'm Kyle Anslow, and I'm joined by the co-host Will Porter. Will, how you doing today?
I'm good. Kyle, how you doing, man?
Doing well. It's been an interesting week in the news with Trump in the hospital, got the COVID. He's
Yeah.
hanging out in Walter Reed, I guess, with all the very sickly vets there. And there, scandal upon scandal. Will, apparently Trump didn't take COVID that seriously, and that's the biggest catastrophe in the world today. So me and you are going to spend all of our time, just like Fox News and MSNBC, talking about that today. Not really. We got important stuff to talk about. Snowden, Breonna Taylor in Iraq. Plenty of interesting stuff, so make sure you share the show. You'll find it online at the Libertarian Institute. We got the YouTube channel where you could get the video feed, or just follow us on the social media platforms. We each got Twitter accounts. He's at the Will Porter. I'm at Kyle Anzalone _ at con_interest is for the show itself. And then you can follow us on Facebook, and we pretty much share, everything on every platform out that we can. So just hit the share button when you see it, recommend it to people, and just make sure you're getting the show in front of more people because we got important stuff to talk about. So we'll talk about one of, if not the most important whistleblower in American history, Edward Snowden. Of course, he leaked tons of documents from the NSA showing the U.S. had a mass spying program. And of course, after he leaked those documents, the former director of intelligence, James Clapper, who lied about the mass spying program, went to jail for it. No, again, another joke. Did not go to jail, but Snowden was forced to exile, and he wrote a book. I really enjoyed his memoir, Permanent Record. I finished. I don't know if you've read it, Will, but it's a good book. The first 2/3 are more just about Ed Snowden. The last third, about the leak and why he did it, and the story behind that, which is fascinating on so many levels, but also just hearing, the guy talk about why it's important for the American people to know this. Anyways, like myself, this book made a lot of money, and it looks like the U.S. Government is trying to, not like I ain't make a lot of money, but I bought the book like a lot of people, so it made a lot of money. And now the government is trying to steal all that money. So not just, the little bit in taxes that they got from the sales tax when I bought it, but $5.2 million. Is that right, Will, that they're trying to steal from Snowden here?
Yeah, you've got that right. This story's been kind of in the works for like a year now. There've been there's been like an ongoing legal case to get him to pay up the proceeds from this book. Originally, I think they said he would have to pay those up like last December, but now just last Thursday they finally landed on an amount. They formally ruled that it would have to be, like, as you said, $5.2 million in not only from book proceeds, but also from a series of like 56 speeches, I think, that he gave on some of the same material, talking about his time at the NSA and some classified stuff. I didn't, unfortunately. I have not read his memoir. I read Greenwald's end of it in his book, No Place to Hide, of sort of the whole story of the Snowden leak and how that all happened. I'm not sure how much Snowden gets into that, and I'm sure he covers it somewhat, but I've read the story from Greenwald's end. However, the government claims that Snowden violated his non-disclosure agreements with not only the National Security Agency but also the CIA, because he had worked for both of them, worked through a contractor, I think, at the NSA at Booz Allen Hamilton. But nonetheless, they say that he didn't submit his book for a pre-publication review. We've talked about that in the context of John Bolton's book. They said the same thing for him. They tried to sue him for that. But with Snowden, it's the same thing. They said, he violated his non-disclosure agreement, didn't submit for pre-publication review, and therefore, that justifies them seizing all the proceeds from this book. And apparently that is indeed, $5.2 million. Now, it had been reported previously, CNN, I think, reported that Snowden had agreed to give up these proceeds. But Snowden and his lawyers have both suggested that that's not the case, that CNN misreported that, and that actually they're trying to appeal and actually fight this decision. His lawyers have said that because this money is held overseas, not in the U.S., they said it would be more difficult for the government to have access to it. But I don't know, we all know that the U.S. government can sort of exert pressure on foreign countries and foreign financial institutions to freeze and seize assets. So I'm not sure how much trouble that would really, how much of a roadblock that would really put up in front of them. But nonetheless, that is what his lawyers are saying, that this might actually be harder than the U.S. government is kind of making it right now. It seems like they're claiming that like they're just going to get this 5.2 million, but really it might actually be a little more tricky for them to seize that because of it being stored overseas.
Do you have any idea where overseas? I could imagine if it's like in a Russian bank, and he's in Russia, which is why I would speculate that it might be there. Where that would seem like that bank could already be sanctioned by the U.S., maybe likely sanctioned, or Russia may be less likely to comply with the sanctions. Where as we've seen with a country like Sweden or the UK and the Julian Assange saga, they're more than willing to go along with the U.S. attempting to violate and silence people's First Amendment rights in order to cover up their crimes. And I'm just wondering, you could, I have no idea, or it could be anywhere. Nobody can know. I'm sure that the, Snowden legal team may have a reason to try to not, publicly be like, oh yeah, it's in a bank account in this country, because then it'd just make it that much easier maybe for the American government to go after it.
Yeah, I hadn't seen any like public discussion of like where the money is actually stored. I had just basically seen his lawyer saying it's not in the U.S.
Okay.
So, I guess you're right though. If it were in Russia, because I mean, like, Snowden is in Russia right now. He's sort of been there, as you said, in exile. And the U.S. obviously wants to extradite Snowden. They've charged him under the Espionage Act. They unsealed charges, I think, right after he, those leaks and stuff. He did his leaks in 2013. But the Russians have not complied with like the demand. I mean, I don't even think the U.S. has made a formal extradition request, because I think it's also true that like we've never sent a Russian suspect back to Russia. So like I don't think they would do the same for us. But yeah, I think maybe like that would make it more likely that a bank would not comply with the sanctions. Like Russia is sort of not complying with the U.S. demands on Snowden. So I am curious, like, where the money is stored too, like whether that's in a friendly country to the U.S., a U.S. ally, or one of what they call a U.S. adversary or whatever. I'm not totally sure.
Right. Yeah. I mean, there's a few other things about this story that really caught my eye. The first one is just, this to me goes along with the U.S. pattern, that it goes back years, which is basically do everything you can to any kind of journalist or whistleblower who makes the U.S. look bad. You could even look at Gary Webb or something like that, or more recently, Assange or Chelsea Manning, where it seems to be the goal to make the person's life as much hell as possible, just to make sure nobody else does this. I mean, if you're a contractor with the NSA or something like that, and you're considering leaking these documents, imagine you have like a family and kids and stuff like that. Do you really want to uproot them to Russia and risk, or uproot them to a different country, or risk going to jail, possibly never seeing them again? I mean, that's a real risk for Julian Assange if he ends up, in a supermax in the U.S. He may never, get to see his children again, and even if he does, he probably won't, have any real physical contact with them. I had to imagine that it would take a heavy toll on somebody trying to make a decision to be a whistleblower or not. And so it just seems like kind of this vindictive attitude that the U.S. typically has towards people who, expose their war crimes and stuff like that. And it seems to go back a long way. So, this doesn't, again, seem to be a uniquely Trump thing, or a problem just limited to Snowden, but I think it's important to talk about specifically, not maybe because Snowden is desperate to get his hands on this $5.2 million, but it's just another way for the U.S. government to harass and bully people into essentially complying. The other thing I find so interesting about this, and this is something that Snowden recently made the case on the Joe Rogan show, which was that he's not even really against coming back to the U.S. to stand trial for what he did. He just wants to be able to make the argument why he did it, which isn't allowed under the Espionage Act. Edward Snowden wants to say, hey, listen, the reason that I did this is because there was a lot of like really sketchy stuff going on at the NSA. They were lying about the mass surveillance program, and I want to get this information out there, because essentially, what the government was doing was illegal. And yet, he's not even allowed to make that argument under the Espionage Act. So that seems like a real problem.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, like, like they do sort of limit your defense like that. They don't really let you argue like I did this for in the public interest. I did this in my role as a sort of a whistleblower. They just make it seem like, it is crazy. They call you it's espionage. They make it sound like you're spying like for some foreign state or something, when really you would be leaking that information for the benefit of the American people.
Right. Yeah, like even when you read this in the public sometimes now, or on like a CNN or something, when they write it up, they make it sound like Snowden grabbed all these documents and ran off to Russia with them when really he gave them to the Washington Post and Glenn Greenwald so the American people could have this information. There's really no espionage about it unless, the American people are the enemy of the US government, which is actually how I think the US government often looks at it. So,
Yeah.
that I think it's kind of telling in that case that this is important information for us to have. Oh, we should at least all know that the government is spying on us, even if it's not necessarily something that they want us to know, or a program that every American wants to end. At least Americans should know that the program's going on, especially when it's specifically written as the Fourth Amendment to the Constitution. They're not supposed to be just spying on everyone. And
Right.
yeah, so hopefully Snowden will get his money. I just mainly don't want the US government to have it. I suppose if Snowden wanted to just give it away to somebody else, that would be just about anything better than the US government taking this. But it just goes on with the war on whistleblowers and journalists and leakers and all the people who bring us the important information. Otherwise, nobody would have it. Even the fact that the U.S. used like biological weapons in Korea, Daniel Ellsberg with the, war in Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, all of those documents are essential, to U.S. history and, making the correct, decisions as far as, informed. If you really want to have a democracy, you have to have informed people. And yet we really don't see this. So, Will, anything else on Snowden that we forgot to mention, or anything else important with this particular case going on?
No, I think the last thing I'd say is just like I don't know if this is a done deal quite yet. Like the last I'd seen from Snowden and his lawyers, they were going to try to fight and appeal this decision. So this may not be like a done deal that he has to hand over this 5.2 million.
Yep. Well, that sounds like a good thing. And also, just, this is another reminder of the importance of podcasts and things like the Joe Rogan experience, where Snowden gets to go on there, make his case directly to the American people why he deserves a pardon. Because, as you said, the CNN, misreports something in this story that's so important. And, yeah, saying that he agreed to pay up, that's not, if that's not true, that's a real problem. And so we got to have shows like ours and the Joe Rogan experience out there to get out the truth and allow these important people to talk. Will, before we move on with the show, let's take a minute to thank our sponsor and tell people about Paloma Verde and how are the CBD products treating you these days, Will?
Yeah, I'm really digging what they sent us. They let us try some of their liquid extracts, their gummy fruit chews, and their soft gels that have they have all kinds of different formulations with CBD. They have one with melatonin, one with curcumin. They have stuff for all different kinds of circumstances. Whether you have like sore muscles or inflammation, or like in my case, insomnia. I have issues with like winding down and relaxing, and I really find this stuff helps. And it is much better than something you're going to find at a head shop or a gas station. Like this, Paloma Verde really has like quality products, and it really does make the difference. And you can go to their website, unlike the stuff you're going to see at the gas station, where you have no idea what the actual dosage is, you have no idea what's really in there. You can go and see at Paloma Verde their lab results, and not only that, you can learn about like what CBD is, what it does. They have a lot of great information and educational stuff over at their website. And if you want to check that out and what they have to offer there, you can go at palomaverdestore.com. That's PALOMAVERDE store.com. And to get 25% off your order, use the promo code PEACE, PEACE.
All right, let's get back to the show.
All right.
Well, the next stories we have here are just some things going on in Iraq. For, I would say, at least the past year and a half, there's been a repeated issue where there's rockets attacks, where rockets are fired by essentially unknown militants. Typically, the U.S. blames the Shia militants, but there's never like inclusive proof or imaging or anything like that, but they'll say, oh, it was the Shia militants in complete Hezbollah or the Iranian batch Shia militants carried out these dangerous rocket attacks. And some of them land near the Baghdad airport, some of them land near the U.S. embassy, a lot of them, land in what they call the green zone of Baghdad. But anyways, this seems to have been on a particular upswing, maybe in the past month and a half. This was going on a lot at the end of 2019. And then eventually you had a couple U.S. soldiers dying in these rocket attacks and some Iraqi soldiers as well around the country. And the U.S., retaliates by taking out Qasem Soleimani and then the Iranian missile attack in response. So this, maybe small attack eventually ends up escalating to a bigger thing. And so this is something like, again, that's been happening. I believe one of these rockets hit the Baghdad airport recently and killed 7 civilians. They're also landing in Iraqi Kurdistan. This isn't just happening in Baghdad, but there's also been rockets hitting the airport in Erbil. And so some of these rockets attacks are, more significant than others, but the U.S. makes a big deal out of them. And again, every time blames the Shia militants, which it says are backed by the Iranians. And so this is essentially just creating hostilities between the U.S. and Iraq and Iran, or the U.S. and Iran within Iraq, though. And so
Right.
it's a pretty complicated thing going on because the U.S. is, trying to withdraw troops at the same time. You've had the Iraqi prime minister at least, saying he's going to try to get a little bit of a hold on this, but doesn't seem to be able to. I think it was the first or the second show we mentioned this just because Israel had carried out some airstrikes near the Iraq-Syria border against Shia militants. And in the past, this has been something that resulted in the rocket attacks having in response. The rockets that they use are pretty just common around the Middle East, and so it's not really possible to like trace them to any particular group. A lot of times, they hide them in like houses, and the silos sit there for a while, and then they fire them all off, and they take out some people. So this could escalate into something big, and I want to bring it up and talk about it on the show. Jason Ditz at antiwar.com, also Dave DeCamp there, have been writing up the story, so you could check them out in the news section of the website every day. And I believe it was the U.S. State Department said that this is the single biggest problem going on right now in Iraq. And I would disagree and say the U.S. troop presence is probably the single biggest problem there. And maybe the second biggest problem would be the Israeli airstrikes, targeting these kind of areas and stuff like that as well. But Will, I'm just curious if you had seen anything suggesting that this was going to escalate the situation in Iraq, or so your thoughts on this story.
Yeah, I mean, like we do have these attacks from time to time, these rocket attacks. It does seem like in the last few weeks they have kind of like stepped up a little bit though. Like I've been seeing more and more reports of them. And as you kind of said, like the US just kind of as a matter of course blames these things on the Shia militias, or what they call the Popular Mobilization Forces, or PMFs, or in Arabic the Hashd al-Shabi. They have a bunch of different names. But the U.S. like rarely will cite evidence when it claims this. Like I don't doubt that like sometimes these Shia militias are behind some of these rocket attacks, but it's just like I'm not I don't like when the U.S. just makes it a matter of course to just pin blame on one type of group without ever offering any kind of evidence. So like I would like to see more proof for this kind of thing. There's all kinds of other militant groups active in Iraq. There's Sunni groups, there's the Islamic State, there's all kinds of like Al Qaeda cells and breakoffs, and all kinds of formulations. And so I'd like to see more evidence when they do, pin these things on Shia militias. But nonetheless, they have been like using these stories of these rocket attacks, or at least pinning the blame on them, to try to like pressure the Iraqi government to rein them in, to like to do something about the PMFs and the Shia militias, which like they are somewhat, some of them are sort of backed by Iran, or they have some ties with Tehran. But like it's probably a little oversimplified to just say it's the Iranians 100% dominating them. And so, but of course, that is the U.S. narrative here that like, hey, you Iraqis better get a handle on these Iranian-controlled groups. And they've recently threatened to like pull out the embassy and do all this stuff. I think even recently threatened to take like unilateral military action against the militias. Some of which I think is kind of bluster. Like, I don't really expect them to pull out the embassy. Like, I think the U.S. wants to still be in Iraq. So it's like that's kind of just like tough talk to try to pressure the Iraqis to do something about the militias. But like honestly, I'm not even sure what the government in Baghdad could do about these militias. Like these militias are in a position that they can fight back. They're not like totally weak. They could put up some kind of fight against the regular Iraqi army. Maybe they couldn't do much against the regular American forces there. But I'm not sure how much the U.S. would really directly look to get involved. I mean, they have done that before. You mentioned the strike against Qasem Soleimani, killed like militia commander in these PMF groups. And so the U.S. has taken unilateral action against them before. I'm just not so sure. Like right now, they would take a mission directly about them. Like I could see them maybe killing an Iraqi commander while they're killing this big Iranian guy. Sort of just as like collateral damage. But I'm not so sure how bold the U.S. would be to just carry out some drone strikes against the actual militia commanders themselves in Iraq. So I do tend to think some of these threats, some of these claims are sort of just bluster against the, designed to pressure the Iraqi government. But it's not so clear what the Iraqi government can even do about this. So like, they may, I'm not so, even if they were to do something about it, it's not like they can just do it all at once. This is like a long-term thing they're going to have to do with like negotiation and diplomacy. The Iraqis are not just going to be able to send the military in there and like, shut down these militia forces. But fortunately, one thing I will say that's sort of like, looks like good news to me is that over the weekend, we did have the Iraqi prime minister confirm that we did pull out 2,500 soldiers. And so all this stuff about the rocket attacks and stuff apparently are not messing up that withdrawal, that drawdown that Trump has been talking about for the last few months. That appears to be like going forward, fortunately.
Yeah, I mean, that's the best news because, I think the thing that'll settle the Iraq situation down more than anything else would probably be the U.S. withdrawing from Iraq. Just something else to add to your point about, could the U.S. or Iraqi government even do anything about these Shia militias? Something we report on constantly during Foreign Policy Focus was the importance of the Shia militias in fighting the Islamic State and their popularity among the Iraqi people for doing that. The Islamic State was going through and being absolutely brutal, murdering people. And fortunately, there was some kind of popular resistance in Iraq that was able to step up and drive those people back, even if they did commit war crimes within themselves. And, at a time we're fighting on the same side of the U.S. government, there's certainly horrible things that happened in that fighting. However, there was a time where people were getting really worried about the Islamic State making a push towards Baghdad. I mean, they had taken to Crete. It was, it was on. And it was in part the Shia militias rallied by Qasem Soleimani and, support by the Iranians and the Quds force there that drove back the Islamic State, not just in Syria on behalf of Bashar al-Assad, but in Iraq on the ground on behalf of the Americans who were using, our air power and training and advisors. But it wasn't our boys on the front. It was these Shia boys that were on the front lines fighting this battle. And so to just say, oh, we're going to disband them or do something about it, I think we've seen over the past couple of years, because this isn't the first time the U.S. has made this demand, that the Iraqi government either doesn't have the will or the ability to just shut these groups down. And it may not even be a good idea in the long run to do it. Again, we talked about this when, the Islamic State was at 2013, 2014 is launching this major blitzkrieg across eastern Syria and western Iraq. They're taking town after town. The Iraqi army turned tail and fled Mosul and all these Sunni towns and let ISIS, come in. And so, without these Shia militias, it's kind of unclear who would fill that power vacuum, because I do think it would leave something of a power vacuum. It's not just as simple as saying that, oh, well, the Shia militias are gone, but now there's no ISIS, so the Iraqi government is stable. I don't see that being the case. So this is, I think, important. I'm sure something we need to keep an eye on. Anything else on that, Will?
Yeah, I mean, last thing I'd say is like they've talked about like training up some new special forces group to like replace and like to fill the spot, to fill the vacuum you're saying that these militias would leave. But it just seems like, they're in training hell right now in Iraq. There's so much training mission creep going on there that like a whole new special operations force in the Iraqi military, you're going to just train that up. and like how much American tax dollars are going to be poured into that project, and how much longer is that going to entail us staying there to help to train up that group. It just seems like a pipe dream. It seems like a ridiculous project to try to embark on when you have this giant military force of trained up militias who have like supply lines and some degree of public support too because of their role in beating back ISIS. Just seems like kind of crazy to try to build up something from scratch to replace them with.
Well,
Doesn't seem
it's,
likely.
yeah, and it's not like the U.S. hasn't tried and failed on this before. It was the Iraq army
Right.
that the U.S. built that turned tail and ran in front of
That's
ISIS
right.
in the
Yeah.
first place. The whole problem was the U.S. disbanded after they came into Iraq. They disbanded the army and left nothing there. And so it seems
Exactly.
like they're just trying to replay that same mistake again. And the U.S. has killed enough Iraqis in this century, and we should just stop and leave and let them try to do what they need to do to rebuild their country. Will, before we
Yeah.
close out today, though, I want to talk about what's going on here in the U.S. with the Breonna Taylor grand jury. We got some information about what was discussed in that grand jury now. Which I don't think is typical procedure, right? Typically, they don't release like the grand jury information. So this is a little bit of a different situation, but the Breonna Taylor story is really important. And I thought it was a good thing to see this just because when I talked to people about this story, more on the street than on the show, the people feel very confused about what the situation is, what actually happened, and then also how a jury couldn't return a guilty verdict or at least charges against the police officers, and so I felt like this maybe enlightened that just a little bit. So what kind of details did we get out of this announcement?
Yeah, the first thing I'll say is you are right that grand jury proceedings typically are done completely in secret. It is very unusual for them to actually release this. But last week, that is exactly what they did. The judge actually ordered the recording of the proceeding to be released. Um, and actually, on that same day, too, on the same day the judge had ordered that, you also had a juror from that grand jury itself who sort of came forward anonymously and said, like, requested that they be allowed to speak about certain elements of what happened during the grand jury, and they're requesting that all the records on it be released as well. Because they're kind of saying like they didn't give a whole lot of detail in their complaint, the grand juror, because they're not allowed to. But they kind of suggested that the attorney general in Kentucky, the state attorney general Daniel Cameron, that he was not being totally honest about like his description of what happened during the proceedings, and that like he had sort of like pinned a lot of responsibility on the grand jurors for like the outcome, when this juror was kind of suggesting that like no, it's really the prosecution who drove the outcome of this whole thing, and that it's not totally on the up and up, and that like the AG didn't really make clear like that certain witnesses weren't called and certain evidence wasn't heard by the grand jury, and so that's what this anonymous grand juror sort of suggested in their complaint, saying that hey, you should release some of this information. But last week on Friday, they actually did the state AG did come out with at least the recording of the proceeding. There's obviously more records than that in a grand jury, but like they at least they released like 15 hours of audio, I think. And there are, I think, some interesting details that it reveals. So
Wait,
like one big
can I just
oh, go ahead.
go just
Sure.
because this is something that if you don't understand how juries work is shocking. That it doesn't seem like there's anybody for like the victim in this case Breonna Taylor to represent her there. This is all the state, right? The attorney general is responsible for trying to convince the grand jury to press charges, right? And so
Yes.
there's no representation of the victim at all in this case, or the alleged victim, however you want to say it, and then it's supposed to be a secret court hearing. It's just it's kind of crazy that that's how the standard system works in the United States. And so I think a lot of times when people hear like, oh, the grand jury did return charges against the cop, this happened in Ferguson and riots ensue, and everybody's like, oh, well, the entire grand jury must be racist. The entire jury pool must be racist. Well, they intentionally select people that don't know things about the case, and then they only present the state side of the case, but pretend like that's actually them trying to do their best to bring charges against these people. Just all the dynamics there and how they actually play out. It's kind of shocking that that's the way our system works. That even when it's a cop that shoots somebody, there's nobody who really seems to be more interested in what happened to the victim rather than representing the state, especially when like you're an attorney general. If your cops kill somebody that they shouldn't have, you're going to have to pay out a lot of money, and that some of that money is probably going to come generally from the tank of money that you get a draw from, would be my guess. So go ahead with some details though, Will.
Yeah, yeah, you are right about that though. Like it's not an adversarial process the way that like a trial would be. Like a grand jury is just a one-sided thing. The state prosecutors like present their case and make an argument, and they claim to be impartial and like not just one-sided. But of course, like that's not usually the case, and in this particular case, it's not been the case clearly. Some of the interesting I think there's one big dispute in this whole case about like whether the cops announced themselves when they were at Breonna Taylor's apartment, like whether they knocked and said who they were, because we know these cops were in plain clothes, and we do have like 10 different witnesses saying that they did not hear them do that, didn't hear them knock or announce themselves as police. However, the AG is saying that there was one single civilian witness who alleges that the cops did say who they were, and like that's sort of like the whole thing of like why it was justified for them to shoot because they said they were the cops. However, in these recordings, in this 15 hours of audio, we do have this investigator from the AG's office who, like, again, I would expect him to sort of be partial on behalf of the government, but he was sort of like, giving some good testimony here. This guy, Herman Hall, this AG's investigator, who said that one of the witnesses, or that one witness, the guy who had said that he heard the cops announce themselves, that they changed their story, that actually that they had originally told investigators they did not hear any announcement. And actually, a lawyer for that very witness, the one who like the AG's whole case is based on, the whole reason they did not charge these guys for murder, this witness's lawyer came out and said that like the cops did not announce themselves at Breonna Taylor's apartment, that the cops only announced themselves to that witness specifically and said, "Hey, we are police." But like it's not like the lawyer came out and said, if you want to choose to believe that what my client said was that the cops announced themselves at the apartment, like go ahead, but that's not what my client said. That's not my client's statement. My client's statement is that the police only announced themselves to the witness themselves. And so that's like a massive discrepancy, because what
Oh
the
yeah.
AG was saying was that the cops announced themselves outside of Breonna Taylor's apartment, and therefore that Taylor and her boyfriend Kenneth Walker ought to have known that these were police because her boyfriend opened fire on them. And their whole story is that we thought they were intruders. But if what this witness is saying is true, then the cops didn't announce themselves, and it would seem that indeed it was justified for Walker to open fire on them. Because the government side of the story is that they knew they were cops, and therefore they didn't have any reason to, like, Walker should not have shot at them, and they were fully justified in shooting back because, hey, like, we're the authorities. So like that's a big deal, I think.
Oh yeah.
Um,
Well, so
Go ahead.
what you're basically saying is that the neighbor bumped into the cops, like maybe outside the apartment or something like that, or maybe the cops knocked on their door and were like, "Hey, we're about to have a shootout in the apartment next door. Maybe you want to leave." But like, if I'm outside walking my dog and the cops pull up, like, I don't, it may even be illegal for me to like text my neighbor, or like the cops could allege maybe I set up an ambush for him if I go and tell the neighbor. It seems so disingenuous to say that, because for a lot of people that's like a big factor, is whether the cops announce themselves or not. Now, I think we've done good work in the past on the show to kind of explain that, like, look, a criminal could claim to be the cops. That's nothing, right?
Right.
That's why the cops shouldn't be doing raids in the middle of the night. That's why they should be dressed in uniform. And if at all possible, wait till she's leaving. People are like, oh, well, apparently maybe she got fired from her job before. So the whole idea of, her to catch her when she goes to work or something like, but it's not like she's not going to go to the store or something. You know what I
She has
mean?
to leave her
Like,
apartment
yeah,
at some
just
point.
wait, catch her then. And, that way it's a safer situation for everybody involved. Remember, a cop got shot in all this too. So, it was somewhat reckless on their part. They were randomly firing into the neighbor's apartment, and the cop gets shot for that, or gets charged for that. So, it's not like a safe situation for anyone involved here. But how misleading is that? That's how they handled and approached that information. What was to claim that meant, that the cops announced themselves when they just told somebody else they were there. That's not the same thing
Exactly.
at all.
Right, completely, yeah, totally dishonest. And like, had we not heard this grand jury recording, the state AG in Kentucky would have been able to just characterize that however he wanted, and we would been forced to, continue believing and talking about this as if, oh yeah, one witness did contradict the other 10 who said they didn't announce themselves. Um,
And
but there's some
just
other.
one more
Oh, go
detail.
ahead.
The attorney general is a black man, and I only point that out because I think for a lot of especially white people, they assume that like, hey, the black guy is going to kind of stand up for a black person, or at least then it can't be that, oh, it's just racism. Right? Like
Right.
that can't be the reason that this happens. And so on top of everything else, the guy has the credibility in this case of, being a black man when, the victim is black, the cops are white and stuff like that. And if he's taking the side of the cops, I know me and you don't feel this way at all. We know how state authority sits together, but for a lot of people, I think their, kind of inclination is that maybe, he would have more sympathy for Breonna Taylor for that reason, would misportray things so much, but, he shouldn't have any of the credibility that people are bestowing on him.
Right, right. I mean, he is a Republican, so that kind of might wipe out his
I mean, but,
credibility there.
but a lot of people just watch the TV. You know what I mean?
Right,
You
right,
just
of
see the
course.
black guy talking, and you're like, oh, well, he's not a racist, so
Right, right.
yeah,
This must be all on the up and up. This all
right.
must be fair.
He has
But
a
we got.
nice title and everything too. He's a state attorney general. But I'm done interrupting you. Go ahead, Will.
It's all good. But yeah, there were a couple other discrepancies like this, like in that came out in some of these recordings. So the cops in their testimony, of course, the police claim that they, announced their presence and stuff, and that they knocked the cops on the raid. They all have the same story on that, as would probably be expected. However, they did contradict each other in other ways. Like one of the cops says that actually, like they were under the impression that there was a small child in the apartment that night, and they were saying that like even though they had a no-knock raid or a no-knock warrant, that they were going to knock anyway because they thought there was a child there, and so they were going to give her lots of time to answer the door. They didn't want to hurt the child. However, one of the other cops then said though that they thought they were under the impression that Taylor was there by herself. And so total, different stories these cops are telling. One is trying to like say like, oh yeah, like we were very careful because we thought a child was there. And then the other cop, I guess, wasn't on board, didn't hear about that he was supposed to say that, that's what they believed, because he said they believed that Taylor was there by herself. And so that's like, I think that also kind of shows there's some, it's a small discrepancy, but there's still some kind of holes in their story.
Well,
Another
especially because
similar.
there's a end up being a boyfriend there, and so both cops are apparently wrong. Had like no idea what was happening in the apartment that they kicked down the door of. It's just kind
Yeah.
of crazy that they have different stories, but neither of them is the reality of the situation.
Right, right. Neither of them had the right story, that there was no child there and that she wasn't by herself either. So they're both wrong. And there's some other like testimony that came out too that sort of indicated that this was kind of like not planned very well. Like they had claimed they had some kind of formal plan, but like one of the AG investigators said, like, I never saw any kind of formal plan. All I saw was a whiteboard that had officers' names on it and like addresses. So like that's the extent of their planning, is here's who's going to go to what house. And even one of the officers who was on the raid had said something. He used the word hodgepodge. He said the group of people was a hodgepodge of different officers. Like, so there's no real reason they were all like working together. They weren't on the investigation. One of the guys was only on there because he was like a canine officer, and that he like volunteered to be on there. So it wasn't very well planned. And you kind of get that idea too from them having no idea like who was in the apartment, who like what, they have no good intelligence on this apparently. But there's another discrepancy too, where one of the police officers, in describing like sort of entering the apartment and stuff and how scary it was and how much danger they faced, he made it sound like Kenneth Walker opened fire on him with a machine gun. Like the way he talks about, he saw all these flashing lights and all this stuff. Yet by all indications, Kenneth Walker only fired his weapon once. And so it does sound like these cops are kind of embellishing, or you might say lying, about how much danger they encountered and how much what kind of like firepower they faced when they entered that apartment. The one guy making it sound like there was like a burst of flashing lights, when it was maybe one flashing light from the one shot that Kenneth Walker fired. But they're making it sound like the guy opened fire with a M249 heavy machine gun or something. So I just think there's another like small discrepancy in the police's story in this thing.
Right, unless the cops
I
saw the other cops shooting in a, because the cops all unloaded like full clips here, right? I think I saw
Yeah.
one cop shot 15 times, one cop shot 16 times. I'm not sure how many times the third cop fired. Also, whichever cop thought that there was a child in the building, because at least one thought that. What the hell, man? You know what I mean? You would think that the plan would be like to just pull back and not have any collateral damage, stuff like that. And then they don't even draw up like a football coach wouldn't send his team on the field with that little of preparation. They're not even gonna like draw
Right.
up a little diagram of like what the plan is. Know what? Again, I guess maybe not do this for every warrant or something, but this is somebody you're deemed being so dangerous that you gotta kick down the door in the middle of the night and go in like the Gestapo. Well, you would think that you would like maybe have a blueprint of the apartment, like have an idea of where
Right.
she's gonna be for your own safety, not for necessarily the person you're trying to arrest or anything like that, but just have an idea of like where you're going, what you're going to do. And then of course the team aspect is another thing that seems to be disturbing here, just because if you have an idea of who you're going into one of these raids with, you know what their personality type is, maybe how they're going to react in stressful and difficult situations. And so if you're going
Right.
in with somebody being a little bit of a hothead, maybe you tell them to stand back a little bit, or at least if they start shooting, that that's not that maybe you don't need to like unload your full clip just because they are, because they go a little bit crazy with that stuff. And so
Right.
it just seems like a complete train wreck, and that the attorney general would hold nobody accountable for this and make such a weak case is disgusting.
Yeah, yeah. And I mean, in addition to like these sort of discrepancies we have, I think the very biggest thing so far that I've seen in this audio, I believe people are still kind of going through it. It's like 15 hours of audio. I certainly have not listened to all 15 hours. I've only heard little bits and pieces of it. And so we very well might get more out of this. But so far, I think the biggest thing is indeed like this discrepancy about this witness, about what the witness actually said about the police announcing themselves. But there's also these little holes about like the officer's stories don't seem to match up. They're kind of weird. Like you're saying, if they thought a child was in the house, then why are they like, emptying their clips into the apartment? That's all just like, I think important. However, one thing that was not included in these recordings is the prosecutors like interactions with the grand jury. They're like their recommendations for how to like indict the guy and how to charge the guy, and the options they laid out for the jurors. That stuff's not included at all in the recordings. And according to the AG, it's like customary that they don't typically record that kind of stuff. However, this like the anonymous juror that came forward with that criminal, or with not criminal complaint, with that complaint, was saying that this is a big deal, that like we really do need to, like the public really should hear how the grand jury interacted with the prosecutors and like what kind of options they were given, because this isn't included in the recordings. However, from what the AG has said, we do have some indication that he did not suggest any charges except for the wanton endangerment charges. And so that's like a huge deal, that like had he maybe recommended a couple different sets of charges, like here's, how you could go, then maybe it would be more significant that the grand jury decided only to charge the guy on the wanton endangerment. But because that was the only charge that was recommended, like there were no murder charges that were even like, presented to them as options, then like that's a big deal. I think that really, and this is what the grand juror was saying. They're saying that like the AG wants to make it sound like this whole outcome was on the grand jury, when really it was more the prosecutors. They're the ones who kind of constrained what could even happen here, what outcome they could have. They designed this outcome. And the grand jury really didn't have that many options and choices of what, how to go about this. And so they're saying they should also make public those, the recommendations. However, they apparently didn't even record those, so I'm not sure how they could really publicize those now. Um, Now, because of this, like specifically this thing about not publicizing the grand jury or the prosecutor recommendations, the Breonna Taylor family is now actually demanding, over the weekend, they requested that a new special prosecutor is put on this case and they redo the whole thing, because they're saying like this AG completely dropped the ball with this, and that like if we have no proof of how they interacted with the grand jury, then like we don't trust this. Like we got to throw this out and start over, basically.
Yeah. Well, I definitely understand that feeling. It does seem like the attorney general really dropped the ball on it, and that was probably the reason we got the outcome that we did. That was
Yeah.
so shocking to a lot of people. Um, yeah, I mean, I think this is more of an indictment of the entire system than anything else. Just realizing that the way we handle this whole thing is absolutely broken, especially when it's the police officers involved in the kind of violence, and being the ones that should be on trial, I guess, only at a grand jury. And
Right.
that this process is so secretive. I also have a lot of sympathy for the grand jurors. Anybody who's watched like enough crime documentaries will like occasionally see one where you have like an old lady, old guy who served on jury 40 years ago or something like that, and they're discussing how they wrongfully convicted somebody, And these people carry the guilt with them their entire lives and feel really bad about it. And you gotta sympathize with these people a little bit because they only know what the prosecutor tells them. And so, if
Right.
somebody gives you bad information, then you guess the answer incorrectly, like that's not all on you. And at times, obviously there's maybe people could think a little bit more critically and stuff like that on a jury, but at the end of the day, there's professionals in the room that are supposed to be telling you how these things are going. I mean, sometimes when you go in court, the judge says, "Oh, you can't even consider this specific, kind of argument or something like that." You have to think about it. You have to answer the question: is this person innocent, guilty, should or should not be indicted? Using this very specific thought process that pretty much only allows for one answer to come up. And so maybe this will be kind of the case that at least forces grand juries to be a little bit more open about what's happening in the courtroom, how it's being investigated, and somehow getting some kind of representation for victims here within the grand jury process to at least make sure that somebody is trying to make the case that the people who killed you are guilty as hell. Because it doesn't seem like that's the case, and a lot of times, if it's a just a regular person, if me or Will do something wrong, you better believe that the prosecutor is going to see it as their mission to convict. And then in this case, that just clearly not what happened, to the point where they pretty much outright lied about it. So,
Yeah, it's unfortunate. Like, oh, go ahead.
oh,
Finish your thought.
I was just gonna ask Will if, uh, like you keep saying that the one grand juror made a complaint. Does that carry like any kind of actual weight to it? I mean, in some way I kind of again feel so bad for the person if like people find out that that you were on that grand jury and that you didn't indict this cop. Maybe your job or your life could be in danger. Yeah, I could see different kinds of recourse that this guy could take or girl could take. Do we have any idea on how that process could play out, or is at this point it's just kind of like they're making a complaint and the court's going to handle it how they handle it?
Yeah, unfortunately, I think it is just a request. Like they are just sort of like, filing this to get the court to decide. However, I think it may have factored into the judge's decision to order this recording released because this all happened on the same day. I think that the judge ordered that after the complaint was filed. I may be mistaken. They may be totally separate and they don't have anything to do with each other. But I thought that the complaint maybe had something to do with the judge's decision. Now, the judge ordered this in the in the case of the cop who was charged with wanton endangerment, Brett Hankison. It was in his like arraignment that I think the judge had ordered this stuff out, ordered this recording released. And then the AG kind of like, took a while. He kind of like twiddled his thumbs a little bit. He was supposed to do it by Wednesday, and then he ended up getting extended till Friday when he finally did it. And yeah, I'm not totally sure, what this grand juror could do from here on out. I have actually heard there is a second grand juror that's sort of come forward to someone in locally in Kentucky and has sort of like expressed similar sentiments that like they're not so sure about the outcome of this either. And so I don't know. I mean, if we have a bunch of like grand jurors coming forward, we may get more out of this, more records out of the proceeding. So that would be good.
Right. And you might not know this, and maybe I'll have to do some more research, but it just popped into my head. There is legal consequences for the grand jury. Like if I sit on a grand jury, I can't then go like to my local news station, have a face to face interview with my face on the TV across from an anchor and say these are all the arguments and all the claims that were made in the grand jury.
Yeah,
It's
no.
a secret process, and so I guess there would be some kind of legal consequences for me if I did that. Right.
Yeah,
All
yeah. I
right.
think
Okay.
you get slapped with some kind of penalty
All
for
right.
divulging that in public.
Yeah, even maybe a contempt of court thing. I don't know. All right, yeah. Not to
Yeah.
mention that, like, with as hot button of an issue as this is, it would probably be very uncomfortable around town. You're trying to go to the Walmart, and everybody knows that you're, one of the guys on the grand jury. So half the people probably hate you, for not coming back with a, murder one charge, and the other half of people, are now pissed off at you for coming out and saying that it sounds wrong because you're going against the cops.
Right.
It's a very difficult situation to be in. So I definitely sympathize with these people trying to stay anonymous and everything. I was just wondering, like, yeah, can you run your mouth about it, or do you have to, like, be very careful about how you go about this? And it sounds like they had to be very careful, for legal reasons. I'm sure social reasons as well. Anything else on this, Will?
No, I think that's about it. There may be more that ends up coming out as people sort of
Hmm.
sift through this 15 hours of audio, but so far those are the biggest things that I've seen out of this.
Yeah, well, the straight up lie about the witness is, the big one, and it seems to
Yeah.
me to be enough to really change some minds, because whether the cops not or not, for me is the first thing that anybody brings up when I talk to them about it. But with that, Will, I think we're ready to wrap up the show for the day. So, everybody, make sure you're checking the show out specifically on the YouTube channel, because we put a lot of work into making this excellent video content. We got the news ticker on the bottom of the screen. We usually have the articles that we're talking about displayed there. Will writes a lot of great stuff over at RT, and we made sure to get those articles up on the screen. So not only can you hear us talk about, but you could check out, what the actual quotes and stuff are. And then our Twitter handles, he's at the Will Porter. I'm at Kyle Anslone _. The handle for the show is at con_interest. Conflicts of interest, shortened it down to make it fit. And, subscribe to the show somewhere, leave a rating and review. Everybody has positive things to say about the show, so let us know if you like it, you don't like it, and we'll make it better. So thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Kyle. Peace out, guys.